देखिए, रंगमंच एक ऐसी कला है जो इसको संसार की सबसे नश्वर कलाओं में माना जा सकता है। यानी वो होते होते अपने को गायब भी करती रहती है, और इसलिए बहुत ज़रूरी है कि जो इतनी जल्दी गायब होता रहता है उसको थाम कर कुछ पकड़ा जाए और उसको किसी तरह से कैद करके रखा जा सके, ताकि बाद में जब ज़रूरत हो तो लोग उसको देख सकें। नटरंग प्रतिष्ठान इस तरह की कोशिश कर रहा है। देवी जी का बहुत बड़ा संग्रह उसके पास है, कतरने, नाटक, पांडुलिपियां, समीक्षाएं, तस्वीरें इत्यादि। और हमारा प्रयत्न ये भी है कि इस समय जो हो रहा है, और इस समय रंगमंच के लिए यूं तो हर कला के लिए संकट का समय माना जाता है, लेकिन मसलन मुझे नहीं लगता कि शास्त्रीय संगीत या शास्त्रीय नृत्य या ललित कलाओं के लिए कि ये कोई बड़ा संकट का समय है। अच्छा समय है और उनको बहुत समर्थन मिल रहा है। राज समर्थन पर उनकी निर्भरता सौभाग्य से कम हो गई है, बाजार उनके लिए बड़ा भारी खुल गया है। लेकिन रंगमंच संकट में है, क्योंकि बहुत दिनों तक हम यही मानते थे कि हिंदी और अन्य भारतीय भाषाओं में जो रंगमंच विकसित हुआ है पिछले 50 वर्ष में, उसका एक व्यापक प्रभाव पड़ा है और शायद उसके दर्शकों की संख्या भी बढ़ी। लेकिन धीरे धीरे इसमें कोई ना कोई विकृति आ रही है। हमने सोचा कि वरिष्ठों पर विचार करने का हमारा रिवाज ही है कि जब तक कोई अधेड़ ना हो जाए, बाल सफेद ना हो जाए, तब तक उस पर ध्यान देना जरूरी नहीं माना जाता। ये भी नहीं माना जाता कि उसने ऐसा कुछ कर दिया होगा जिस पर गंभीरता से, जिम्मेदारी से मिल बैठकर विचार किया जाए। अधिक से अधिक छोटी मोटी एक आध रिव्यू वगैरह छप जाती है, जो अब मालिकों के सौजन्य से जिसकी जो लंबाई है वो कम होती जाती है। कुछ अखबारों से तो वो गायब ही हो गई। यानी इसका कोई रिकॉर्ड ही नहीं होगा कि हमारे समय में, जब इस शताब्दी का अंत हो रहा है, हमारे रंगकर्मी क्या कर रहे हैं। और वही नहीं जो पिछले 50 साल से करते रहे, वो बड़े बड़े रंगकर्मी हैं, उन पर कुछ ना कुछ तो हमने विचार किया है। पर वो लोग जिन्होंने काम 10, 15, 20 बरस पहले शुरू किया है, और जो दरअसल हमारे वरिष्ठ रंगकर्मी होंगे 21वीं सदी की शुरुआत में, इसमें भी मुझे कोई संदेह नहीं लगता कि पिछले 50 वर्षों में भारतीय रंगमंच में जो कुछ हुआ है वो हमारी श्रेष्ठतम उपलब्धियों में से है। साहित्य के बारे में, जिसका कि मैं छोटा मोटा क्यों भी हूं, विचार नहीं होता, लेकिन रंगमंच के क्षेत्र में पिछले 50 वर्ष बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। और इसलिए हमने सोचा कि हम 3 अपेक्षा, हालांकि फैजल कह रहे थे कि इस तरह से जब बोलना पड़े तो लगता है कि आप पहले से ही रिटायर हो गए। तो हमारे यहाँ रिटायर लोगों को ही बोलने का, हालांकि मेरे बारे में नहीं कहा जा सकता, मैं जिंदगी भर से बात कर रहा हूँ। इनको देखा जाए, कुछ गौर से देखा जाए, कुछ जिम्मेदारी और समझ से देखा जाए, कुछ प्रश्नवाचकता से भी देखा जाए। और इसीलिए हमने ये आयोजन किया है। इनमें इन तीनों के अलग अलग दृष्टियां हैं, और हमको ये जानने की जिज्ञासा होनी चाहिए कि आखिर अनामिका अक्सर अपना नया मुहावरा कैसे गढ़ रही है, और उस गढ़ने के पीछे उनकी नजर क्या है। उनकी नजर पर कुछ हमको भी थोड़ी पैनी नजर और समझदारी की नजर, मतलब पैनी होने का मतलब ये नहीं है कि आप हम कहीं हवा में उड़ा दें। इसी तरह से फैजल और काजी जो इतने वर्षों से काम कर रहे हैं, वो शिक्षा के क्षेत्र में भी सक्रिय हैं। वो रंगमंच को एक सामाजिक कर्म के रूप में भी, यानी विकलांगों के साथ और बच्चों के साथ, या अरविंद गौड़ हैं जो यहाँ, बाकी सब लोगों ने अब थिएटर करना बंद ही कर दिया है, ये बहुत कम कर दिया है, और बेहतर काम लोगों को मिल गया है, या निठल्ले हो गए हैं जो भी। वहाँ एक आदमी है जो अपना लगातार रंग कर्म किए जा रहा है। तो ऐसे लोगों, ऐसे 3 लोग हमने चुने हैं। आप पाएंगे कि इनके काम में बहुत विविधता भी है। इन्होंने तथाकथित शास्त्रीय नाटक भी किए हैं, जिनको आजमाए बिना आपकी प्रतिष्ठा नहीं बनती कि आपने शेक्सपियर नहीं किया, और ब्रेख्त नहीं किया, और एनेस को नहीं किया, और फलाना और ये तो दारियों को ही नहीं किया आपने, तो आप हैं किस मसरफ के। तो ये सब भी इन्होंने किया है, और बहुत सारे नए नाटक भी किए हैं। हमारी अपनी जो नाटकों की रिपर्टरी है, यानी अगर हम मान लें कि हिंदी में एक बड़ी भारी रिपर्टोयर है नाटकों का, तो उसमें भी इन्होंने इजाफा किया है, नई चीजें आजमाई हैं। इस सब को देखना दिलचस्प होगा। हम उम्मीद करते हैं कि आप जो यहाँ आए हैं अपनी इस जिज्ञासा को, ये तीन रंगकर्मी क्या कर रहे हैं, शांत कर पाएंगे और थोड़ी जिज्ञासा बचाए रखेंगे, ताकि इनके काम पर आपकी नजर बाद में भी बनी रहे और आपकी दिलचस्पी भी बनी रहे। महाराज, ये तो आपको थोड़ा सा सुस्थिर करने के लिए था। अब मैं श्री नेमिचंद्र जैन से आग्रह करूंगा कि हमारे पहले रंगकर्मी का परिचय कराएं और फिर हम कार्य आरंभ करेंगे।
इस योजना का रूप यही है कि जो तीन निर्देशक हमने चुने हैं, वे अपने काम के बारे में, अपने विचारों के बारे में, अपनी योजनाओं के बारे में, अपनी शैली के बारे में वक्तव्य देंगे। कोशिश ये करेंगे कि जो कुछ वो कर रहे हैं उसका उदाहरण सहित परिचय आपको कुछ मिल सके, आप देख सकेंगे वो क्यों और क्या और कैसा कर रहे हैं। उसके बाद आप उनसे संवाद कर सकते हैं, बातचीत कर सकते हैं, और जो कुछ सवाल उनके इस वक्तव्य से उठते हैं उनके बारे में चर्चा कर सकते हैं। मैं समझता हूँ कि ये आदान प्रदान हम सब के लिए उपयोगी होगा और हमारे आज जो लगाव है रंगमंच से उसको शायद गहरा करेगा। अब मैं सबसे पहले ऐसे ललका जी को आमंत्रित करना चाहता हूँ। उनके नाम से आप सब लोग दिल्ली में रहने वाले सभी परिचित हैं। 70 के दशक में उन्होंने काम शुरू किया और नए ढंग का काम शुरू किया, एक नई संवेदना से, नई दृष्टि से काम शुरू किया। उसके बाद से वो लगातार सक्रिय रहे हैं और रंगकारी के अलग अलग रूपों में, अलग अलग पक्षों में सक्रिय रहे हैं। वो उन निर्देशकों में हैं जिन्होंने अपने नाटकों के चुनाव में किसी न किसी विषय को, किसी न किसी विशेष मुद्दे को आधार बनाया है और नाटक चुने हैं। और ये एक बड़ी महत्वपूर्ण बात है कि केवल नाटक कोई अच्छा है, करने में उससे संतोष मिल सकता है इसलिए नाटक उन्होंने नहीं किए, बल्कि इस दृष्टि से भी नाटक किए कि जो हमारी सामाजिक समझ को, हमारे एक तरह से जिंदगी के साथ जो हमारा लगाव है उसको और गहरा कर सकें। उसमें अगर कोई चीज़ें छूट गई हैं तो वो उनको सामने ला सकें। तो इस दृष्टि से उनका काम बहुत महत्वपूर्ण है। उन्होंने हर तरह के नाटक किए हैं, परिचित, कम परिचित, एकदम नए और साथ ही साथ जो प्रतिष्ठित हैं, बड़े लेखकों के नाटक हैं। विदेशी रचनाकारों के महत्वपूर्ण नाटक भी और देश के महत्वपूर्ण रचनाकारों के नाटक भी, साथ ही साथ साधारण सामान्य जो परिचित लोग हैं उनके नाटक भी। इसके अतिरिक्त उन्होंने बच्चों के साथ बहुत महत्वपूर्ण काम किया है। इस तरह के बच्चों के साथ काम करने के संगठन बनाए हैं जिनके जरिए से बच्चों को अपनी आत्माभिव्यक्ति का मौका मिल सके। ये सब काम उनका, जिससे आप अधिकांश परिचित हैं, उनको दृष्टि से किसी तरह के और परिचय की जरूरत नहीं है। मैं अब उनसे अनुरोध करता हूँ कि वो आएँ और अपना वक्तव्य आपके सामने कैसा लगता है।
Because many of the people sitting here have seen my plays over the years, and I think therefore it's a very informed audience, and I'm very grateful that Natarang has given me this opportunity. I think I'm going to talk basically about three different things this morning. One is very much on the question of what is the problem that goes with interpreting a play. One, how one chooses a play, and how one chooses to go into the interpretation of a play. That's the first subject that I'm going to touch on. The second section will go much more into the entire production process. कि पहले reading से लेकर या उससे पहले भी right till the final product, and even after the shows, what is the process that we go through. And for that we will be doing short sequences, 3 very brief sequences from Rishte Naate, which is my most recent production, many of you all have seen, and a sequence from an earlier play, Letters Home, done by me 11 years ago and revived just through a very brief rehearsal with Smita and Mona. And talk about two other plays, how we've gone through the production process. One is Vijay Danteta's story, Kenchuni, the process of adaptation and making it into the play Orni. And through slides and talking through how we workshopped and created what I did with NSD's TIE company last year, Ye Bhi Jungle, Wo Bhi Jungle, based on Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book. And then the third section, I'll talk about what Nemi ji has very rightly perhaps pointed out, why these themes, how have the themes developed, how have they changed over the years, what were the compulsions that brought forward certain themes. And I think many questions for myself which have arisen from the process of sitting over the last 2 weeks and really looking back and then seeing very discernibly certain trends and some things which one hadn't noticed at all before. So I just plunge straight in. In choosing a play to direct, what's most important to me is not only what the play means, but more importantly, how it means what it means. In other words, how has the playwright brought forward the meaning of the play? It is only by answering this very crucial question that one can begin to work towards what increasingly we know as that word style. Because here we encounter the problem of artistic judgment. Which style is going to be the correct or the appropriate one for that particular play? And as we know today, there are various ways of interpreting any particular script. There is always the possibility of losing the actual play and its meaning in the use of stylistic excess. In my view, there is no point in thrusting a style on the play for the sake of just being different. Therefore, the criteria one has to consistently apply over one's entire career is asking that question, is there a right interpretation? And indeed there is, but the right interpretation, in my view, is one which most faithfully conveys the author's intention, or very precisely, the inherent meaning of the play. So this I will deal with in the first section of what I'm talking about this morning, the problem of interpretation. To get into the interpretation of a play, I usually go through an attempt to reconstruct and recreate, perhaps to a certain extent, the creative process which the author himself went through. And to do so, there is a real need for looking at it in a very systematic and organized way, rather than doing it only intuitively or instinctively. The three basic problems when I've chosen a particular play is looking just at three issues. One, very much for me, what is the play about? What is the issue? And to understand this, I would normally read through most of the author's other work to understand what is it that he's trying to convey. It is only through an insight into these major themes and preoccupations that one can more clearly understand the meaning of this particular piece in that author's progress. Then, very obviously, since many of us are theatre workers here, the attitudes of the character in the play to that issue, the author's position himself to the issue at hand, the allusions in the play, the aspects of the contemporary culture and political events that illuminate the writing. For instance, you cannot understand Dario Fo without understanding his position in the left party, in Italy, his breakaway, and his subsequent career. Do other works of the author carry out the same strand of thinking? That is the first question that I would address to myself on an individual basis. The second major question would be, what is the play's theatrical context? The evidence from the script are the sources to answer questions about the play's original staging. And there we can immediately think of examples. I don't think we have to think very far, to the Greek tragedies, to classical Sanskrit drama, to Shakespeare, and to a modern play, or for that matter, to a play by Ibsen. How does the script itself reveal the relation that existed at that time between the form of the play, the actual theatre that it was performed in, acting areas, mechanical devices? How does the architectural form of the theatre where we are going to perform determine how we are going to present the play? How is it going to be different when it's done down here in the basement, when it goes up into the Sri Ram main auditorium, when Orni moves from an open-air setting into an interior one? About the players, what are the acting conventions that the play was written in? Does the play create the illusion of ordinary conversation, as for instance, very obviously, in an Ibsen play? Or does it use the techniques of asides, soliloquies, tirades? What acting conventions does my audience expect to see in this play? What is the relation between the actor and the audience? Is it just sitting there as a silent witness, watching what is happening on the stage through that imaginary fourth wall between one character and another? Does it see the ambivalence that's created on the stage between the character and the actor, which we've also explored in a number of productions, and I'll talk of this later? Does it expect to see the character directly address the audience? And finally, and perhaps most importantly for me, is what is the play like? What is the overriding rus of the play? We would understand it more simply in that way. So for this, one would first read through the play, and as you're reading it, visualize it. Look very carefully at the stage direction, the set and the character descriptions. And I think we did a lot of that when we did Rishte Naate Jayamantalvi's play, because all of you all know, unke scripts mein ye khas baat hai, that as much as the dialogue is what is within the brackets. He describes everything to a T, what the character is wearing, what he looks like, what is the expression on the face, the way he walks, that his collar is frayed, that his cuffs are torn. Everything is described in great detail. Then of course the title of the play itself would give us a clear indication. Adya Out at Sea, Rishte Naate, the names of the characters themselves, whether it's Vilom, Kana Surpala Army, or any of the other characters that we are familiar with. And then a further reading. So I do not search immediately for that overriding kind of brand image that will determine the style in which we're going to do the play. But this emerges out of two different processes. One, through the actual process of direction and working with the cast through the production process, and through the design of the sets, the costumes, and the music, which I'm often very involved in. But the first technique that I often use in approaching a play is an associational technique. So I would read a play, let it remain in my mind, and try and think what are the immediate things that come to mind. Looking back for preparing this talk, I found that a whole lot of sketches I'd done when I did Ashar Ka Ek Din in 1972, 25 years ago, there were a lot of sketches that were there which were done directly from M.F. Husain's paintings. So I took the paintings, went through many of them, sketched out some, and very clearly I could see, as I was sharing with Rashmi and Nemiji the other day, the sketch itself and finally what it looked like in the production. It was very interesting to see that those very images from certain series of Husain's paintings one could directly recreate on the stage. Alright? Or for people who look in detail at the exhibition upstairs, you can see the very strong influence of a painter like Salvador Dali for many of the settings that I used for the absurd plays, and how that was an entry point into that particular genre of play. Of course, then one looks at architectural styles and painting styles of different periods. I will be talking in much more detail about Lehron Ke Rajans quite soon, and why we chose to play in a certain, with a certain kind of aesthetic view. And then one can contrast it with something like Rishte Naate, where the setting was worked on in a great amount of detail to get the whole idea of this overcrowding, this overstuffed kind of chawl in Bombay. Music often for me is a very good entry point into a play. How we're going to use the music. And I think in Rishte Naate there was a tremendous use of Hindi film music for the first time. I'd never used that genre at all. But the whole idea that there is a whole idea of romance in the Hindi cinema, which seems to be so missing from the lives of the people in this particular play, and how we built up that whole tension between that, very much the idea of really the Hindi romance, which is very close to Rona, I think, and just the concept of what happens with the main protagonist in the play. And similarly with the use of sound effects, which many people have remarked on in the various plays we've done, I think most particularly when we did Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maan. Then one works towards developing the idea, keeping in mind that this idea is going to get tremendously altered during the rehearsal process. And at this very stage, right at the incipient stage, I'm very cautious that I do not repeat or overkill the idea to its death. So there is, for me, a tremendous need for being in charge of and linked with all the disciplines. The choice of the music, the aspects of design, the lighting, because I felt that these will all express the meaning very clearly. And I think when we talk of Rishte Naate, I'll talk more about this. Let me give a very concrete example. When we did Mohan Rakesh's Lehron Ke Rajans, the entire cast in the play read through all the 4 full-length plays by Rakesh ji and the 2 short Beej Nataks of Rakesh, And as also the two earlier variations of the Nehru theme, the radio play Raat Beetne Tak and the earlier Lehron, which had a totally different third act. We attempted to see the themes and characters of Rakesh in continuation through all his work, and not as isolated entities. So we saw how the characters of Ashar Ka Ek Din became the characters of Lehron Ke Rajhans and later became transformed into the characters of Aadi Adhure. Besides this work on and around the script, the cast also worked for an intensive 10-day period on improvisations just related to themes of the play. It was only after all this preparatory work had been done by the entire cast who was to perform that we actually picked up the script. So it's not the first day that we start with the script, it's a little into the process. Typically then, in the first 10 or 12 rehearsals which we start with the script, are sit-down rehearsals, reading, discussing, and analyzing, as one actor just put it, threadbare the intentions of the author. The views of all the members of the cast are drawn out. And every cast usually has a mix of very new people in the group and the team who've worked with me for very many years. I think this factor is very crucial, as it's only after working with a team over a period of time can we go beyond just doing the basics. And we can go into the nuances, the details, the texture, the fine-tuning of the entire performance. I believe only when we are all totally conversant with what the author is trying to say and how he is trying to say it, which we try to communicate to the audience, and we begin work on looking at interpretation. Because to be true to the author's intention is finally what we are attempting to do. It is only once this intention is totally clear to all of the cast that can we bring across this intention to the audience clearly. There can be no laziness in this department, and certainly it involves a lot of time and energy, all of which I feel is very well spent. Then we are ready to move into the area of research. For instance, once again for Lehron Ke Rajhans, an important dimension of our production of the play was the research into the recreating the lifestyle of that particular period. Although our production did emphasize the universal conflict that is the theme of the play, we all felt it necessary to present it in an authentic historical environment. Though the play is set by Mohan Rakesh in 300 BC, the time of the Buddha, the style of writing that he's used, the language that he's employed, the imagery are so reminiscent of Kalidas and the host of other Sanskrit playwrights that we felt it would be more apt to present it in the very graceful, inward-looking quality of the Ajanta murals painted during the Gupta period, rather than in the heavier style of the Sachi and Bhalu sculptures, which are contemporary of the Buddha. Our attempt was to recreate a lifestyle that would be as appealing to the intellect as it would be to the senses. And I still recall spraying the entire stage with the scented room freshener just before the curtain went up. Not to say that every historical play that we do, we necessarily go back to the period. And I think I'd like to give an immediate contrast of the play that we did called The Public Prosecutor, which we also did in Hindustani, which deals with events towards the end of the French Revolution. But there the purpose was very much to find a connection between what was happening at that period in French history, post the Reign of Terror. Robespierre had killed Danton, Robespierre himself had been killed by the guillotine, and we wanted to position it in a contemporary setting without making it Delhi and putting everybody into kurta pajamas and making them all Netajis. So through a large process of looking at the play and discussing with all the actors, we hit upon this idea of putting it in a totally contemporary business setting. People in suits, the setting anywhere. And increasingly as we went through the rehearsal process, Mona playing the central woman character, the only woman character in the play, we found more and more connections between the way she was playing the part and Indira Gandhi herself. This was long after Indira Gandhi had come and gone. And I remember one particular moment in the play where the audience would really gasp when they saw what had happened, because there is on the stage, on the table of the public prosecutor, just a very simple piece of sculpture which has a whole lot of pins, common pins in it. And whatever you put onto that remains as an impression. So very early in the play he puts it on his face and he keeps this on his desk, and it's his face, the public prosecutor's face, which remains there and is very prominent. And when she comes in and she fools around with the things on his table, she just leaves that impression of her hand on this thing. And the audience didn't need to have anything more said. The connection was very clear with what political figure we had linked and how one saw the woman in this play, who was otherwise dressed in Western clothes, and we'd set it very much in a European setting. So it was all in Hindi and talked about events of the 1790s. So there was this real juxtapositioning of things which came together to form an image. Here is a description from a totally different production, from my production notebook when I did Mahesh L. Kunchwal's Rapture, which details the action on the stage before a single line of dialogue is spoken. Sound of busy traffic, car horns, radios blaring, crows. A slow crossfade with the sound of desultory Vivid Bharati commentator. The pings of the ants. A film song quite distant. The lights slowly fade up on the stage, cross-lighting, heavy shadows, a shape on the bed, tense, not relaxed. She sits up with her back to the audience. She moves around the room, into the drawing room, heavy shadows, into Raja's room. A smile crosses her face. She smoothens the pillow, finds a magazine, leaves through it and smiles. Her daughter Lilu enters in the drawing room. Padma re-enters from Raja's room. There's a bitter exchange of looks between the two. Lilu exits inside the house. Padma goes into her own room where she stands looking out. The voice of Bhav from offstage. Lilu peers out excited. He enters briskly into an empty hallway. He sits down disinterestedly. A long pause. Padma enters the drawing room and she sits in the chair. There is a long pause. And then the first line of dialogue in the play begins. Now this is of course not there at all in Mahesh's original script. You pick it up and it's Bhav enters and the first line of dialogue. So this is created by the cast during rehearsals. To build up the very realistic kind of playing in this play, in Rapture, we went through a sequence of improvisations to get us more and more into playing these characters. Here are just some of the 7 or 8 different improvisations that we used. One was sit in front of a mirror, look at yourself as though it were another person and describe that person aloud to the rest of the cast in the third person. Okay, that's one. A second one, sit together as a group and each one of us go into talking about some image, incident, crucial event from our own childhood, and that is shared by all the people in the cast. Another one, just pointing at different people in the cast and the crew, and just the first thoughts that come into their minds, they articulate. So really a stream of consciousness kind of technique. And it's very interesting, because a lot of the apprehensions of actors, their worry, their fears, their excitement, their preoccupations with life outside of the rehearsal all come to the front. Getting actors to talk about the loneliest moment in their lives, what they have experienced for themselves as being the loneliest moment. An improvisation that we often use is, sometime during the day, for yourself, in your mind, record a moment of your life. Just 1 minute. You bring that minute together, and then we do it as an improvisation simultaneously. So everybody who's recorded one moment of their previous day, in their own mind, comes back and reenacts in this setting. So it may be you're cooking at home, it may be that you're waiting for transport to get to the rehearsal, it may be that you're lying in bed having a phone conversation, silent by yourself. And then we start seeing these very individual, isolated moments in juxtaposition with each other, as we're finally going to do in the production of the play, for this particular play. Another thing that they were asked to do outside of rehearsals was switch off sometimes during the day. This is a very crucial part of this particular play, that lack of communication. So really switch off at home, in any situation, in your office, in your home place, and you just consciously cut off other people. So you're in a conversation with somebody else and just switch yourself off and just see how you're reacting at that moment. How are they reacting to you? What are the kind of feelings that have engendered in their real life outside of the rehearsal? And then quite often in that play, which I must say we haven't used subsequently, is switch the roles and get them to read the other person's part in the same scene. So we would be well into the rehearsal process, we reach some kind of a block with the actors and say, okay, let's totally switch the two characters having this confrontation, read the other person's part and let's play the scene that way, and let's see how it's working, how are we feeling, how is it different to look at the whole situation from the character from totally different kind of viewpoint. Each play that one does requires a completely different rehearsal process. No two times have we done plays the same way. I'll now show you some 3 different excerpts from my most recent production, Rishte Naate by Jaivan Dalvi. As most of you know, in any script by Jaivan, there is a huge amount of instruction of what we have to do. But even then, even though somebody said this is like a Samuel French acting it, as the director of the play, putting this terrible color onto the walls, but which I was persuaded by many people from Bombay and Pune was dead right. The furniture in this room is all old and made entirely of wood. In the positioning itself, it's all there. Oh my God, this is very sophisticated equipment. Come, we need to all come up here. There are barred windows, or with those double shutters, you know, very typically in the Bombay household with the double shutters. So there's a wall that runs along here. Let's bring this, put it here, there's the bed. Okay. So that way, right? Yeah. Okay, so there is a bed, broken down kind of one. Let's move this back up. And if you can both bring the table from inside. And here a very crucial part of this play is a table with a typewriter, and it's like the only space in the room where things can be piled up and kept. There are a lot of things below the table. पुरानी डालडा का डिब्बा है, पुरानी डब्बे हैं यहाँ पर, और इसके ऊपर typewriter, which is the main thing for. Let's get some more chairs here. And there's a door going in here. Here. Put it there. One more chair, no? Faded nylon kind of sari. Leads to the inside of the house. As you come out, there is a mirror on the wall, and all along this wall, there is that wonderful word that it took very long to understand in a Bombay context what it meant. The khuntis on which there were many clothes. Those folding things which you don't get in Delhi. Wooden folding. जिसके ऊपर कपड़े टांगते हैं. So lots of them over here. So it's a very, very busy set of walls. Here there is a place where you can wash your feet. Okay? You've got everything where you want it. Okay. So when and the lights first come up through the windows and catch him in a tremendous distress of light. So we'll be doing it with just some of the music that went with the opening of the खेल रहा है बच्चू. जब भी तुझे सुसु आता है तेरा नाड़ा तुझसे खुलता नहीं, फिर तू उछलता कूदता रहता है. हाँ, क्या सुपारी खाएगा? अरे रुक जा, देती हूँ. ये ले. और खाएगा? बस बच्चू, सुपारी खाने जैसे नहीं खाते. अरे मैंने ही गलती की कि तुझे सुपारी दे दी. ये नमकीन नहीं है कि खाए चले जाओ. खत्म हो गई भाई. अरे रुक जा, देती हूँ. ये ले. ना 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 ना. ए बच्चू, अरे जमीन पर गिरी चीज उठाकर नहीं खाते बेटा.
तू आंखें फाड़ फाड़ के क्या देख रहा है? ये लिपस्टिक मैंने तेरे बाबा के पैसों से नहीं खरीदी, और अगर खरीदी भी है तो तेरे बाबा मेरी जान नहीं निकालेंगे। अरे आए क्यों नहीं अभी तक? जा खिड़की से देख। अरे जा खिड़की से देख। तेरे बाबा टेलीग्राम ऑफिस में काम करते हैं, टेलीग्राम भेजते हैं। वो टेलीग्राम किसी को टाइम पर मिलता भी है। ए बच्चू, पापा के आने तक तू चुपचाप यहाँ बैठ सकता है? हाँ? तू चुपचाप यहाँ बैठ सकता है कि नहीं? लेट होने की तो उनकी पुरानी आदत है। तार घर से निकलकर दुनिया भर में घूम घूम कर टाइपिंग का काम ढूंढते रहते। उन्हें परवाह ही नहीं कि मुझे देर हो रही होगी। काटदरे, देखो जरा टाइम क्या हुआ है। अरे अब मैं ऑफिस किस लिए जाऊं?
हाँ भाई, मैं आज थोड़ा लेट हो ही गया।
थोड़ा लेट? जरा घड़ी तो देखो। अच्छा, तुम टेलीग्राम ऑफिस में काम करते हो, टेलीग्राम भेजते हो। वो टेलीग्राम किसी को टाइम पर मिलता भी है?
शैला, मेरे ऑफिस को बुरा भला मत कहियो। अरे हम तो सब दफ्तर से टाइम से निकले थे, बीच में होटल चले गए।
सुना बच्चू, आज तेरे बाबा होटल होकर आए हैं और कुछ खर्चा भी करके आए हैं।
शैला, मेरा मजाक क्यों उड़ाती है तू हमेशा?
तो होटल में क्या 2 गिलास पानी पीकर ही बाहर आ गए तुम?
शैला, आज सारा खर्चा वेंकट रामन ने दिया था। अरे आज तो हमने उसकी जेब भी काट डाली।
अरे वो वेंकट भी नाइट शिफ्ट करने लगा?
शैला, वो तो 2 दिन की छुट्टी पर था। वो अभी स्टेशन से आ ही रहा था कि हम उसे होटल ले गए और उसकी जेब काट डाली। उसकी लॉटरी जो निकली थी यार।
उस बेवकूफ रमन की, उसकी भी लॉटरी निकल आई। कितने लाख की?
5 रुपए की। टिकट का आखिरी नंबर निकला था। और क्या?
5 रुपए? फिर तुम्हारे होटल का बिल किसने दिया?
चला बिल था 15 रुपए का और हम थे 4 उडीपी होटल में। मिसल खाई और चाय पी। तू तो जानती है ना, मैं तो चाय पीता नहीं, तो 2 बारी मिसल मंगवाई मैंने।
अगर तुम्हें मिसल इतनी पसंद है तो कभी कभी अपने पैसे खर्च के भी खा लिया करो।
हाँ भाई, खाने का क्या है, लेकिन पैसा तो मेरा जाता है ना।
काटरे, आज मैं तुम्हें कुछ बदली बदली नजर आ रही हूँ क्या?
क्या क्या कह रही है?
मैं जा रही हूँ। खाना हीटर पर पड़ा है, गरम करके खा लेना। गैस बंद करना भूलना नहीं। पतीले में बैगन का मसाला भी है। कल का है, थोड़ा बासी होगा, ठीक ना हो तो फेंक देना। अब जाऊं?
जा भाई जा।
ये बेवकूफों की तरह बर्ताव करना जरूरी है क्या?
क्या हुआ शैला? वो जो नया अफसर आया, क्या नाम है उसका तेरे दफ्तर में? कौन है वो?
मिस्टर पंडित।
तो उस पंडित का पंडित पर मुझे मत सुनाना। मैं तो जैसा हूँ वैसा हूँ।
तो तुम क्या लोगों के सामने भी ऐसे ही अपनी बगल ऊपर करके घूमते हो?
शैला, तू ऐसा कर, अपने पंडित को यहाँ बुला ले और अपनी दोनों बाहें उसको ऊपर करके बगल दिखा अपनी।
दिखाऊंगी दिखाऊंगी। अरे मेरी 9:34 की गाड़ी भी गई। बस बच्चू, इतना प्यार अच्छा नहीं। काट दो रे, तुम आज इसके बाल काट डालो और इसे नहला भी दो।
शैला, ये काम मुझसे नहीं होगा। मैं घोड़े के पैर में नाल लगा सकता हूँ, ये काम नहीं कर सकता।
And could do it all.
Appealing to him to get medical diagnosis and help only brought on explosive outbursts of anger.
But her mother couldn't really see how incapable that poor girl is of thinking in this state.
One morning in mid-August 1940, Otto stubbed his little toe against the base of his bureau. That afternoon I asked to see his foot. The toes were black and red streaks ran up his ankle. There was no protest this time as I rushed to telephone my doctor. Diabetes mellitus. The announcement burst upon me like a clap of thunder. So this was his illness. Not cancer at all, but an illness which treated in time could be lived with and controlled. From that day on,
it's none of my business.
Life was an alternation of hope and fear.
And feel very inadequate and responsible.
On the nurse's first day off, Otto suggested I go out into the sun with Sylvia She and I ran along the beach together for only about half an hour.
Inadequate.
On my return, I found Otto collapsed on the staircase.
And responsible.
Somehow, I half carried him to his bed.
If you were her mother, she would be all right.
The next day, the doctor came. Amputation from the thigh of the gangrened foot and leg would be necessary to save Otto's life.
If you were her mother, she would be all right.
On October 12th, the amputation was performed. On November 5th, when I left Otto, his condition was serious. My telephone was ringing when I returned home. It was the doctor. An embolus had struck in a lung and caused my husband's death as he slept.
If you were her mother, she would be all right.
I waited until the next morning to tell the children. When Warren awoke, I told him as quietly as I could that Daddy's sufferings had ended. Warren sat up, hugged me tightly. Oh, Mommy, I'm so glad you're young and healthy.
Inadequate. Responsible.
Then I faced the more difficult task, telling Sylvie, who was already reading in her bed. She looked at me sternly for a moment, then said woodenly, I'll never speak to God again.
I'll never speak to God again! There is the sort of person who has problems and tells them to one understanding person. There is the sort of person who has problems. There is the sort of person who has problems and never tells them to anyone. There is the sort of person who fools everyone, even herself, into thinking that there are no problems, except those shallow material ones which can be overcome.
I told her that she need not attend school that day, if she'd rather stay at home. From under the blanket which she had pulled over her head came her muffled voice. I want to go to school.
I want to go to school. For all my brave, bold talk of being self-sufficient, I realize now how much you mean to me. You and Mummy, you and Grandpa and Grandma. I'm glad the rain's coming down hard. It's the way I feel inside. I love you so.
After school, she came to me, red-eyed, and handed me a piece of paper. In shaky writing stood these words: I promise never to marry again. I signed at once.
What a superlative mother you've been to me.
I looked at the rumpled document I had just signed and knew that unless I should have the opportunity to marry a man I respected, loved, and trusted to be a good father to my children, and whom the children wanted for their father, I never would marry again.
I wonder if I will ever meet a congenial boy.
That was the explanation I gave Sylvia as a college student. That document never kept you from marrying again, did it? I assured her it had not.
All this leads up to my date last night. I told him how I like to write and draw and know people more than just on the surface. He was rather overwhelmed by the fact that I could be so intelligent and yet not be ugly or something. This weekend I went out Saturday with Bill. I will ask for Mondays off because there's nothing I'd rather do than see Dick. Oh, love, 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 Sivvy.
Love. 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 When I viewed Otto at the funeral parlor, he bore no resemblance to the husband I knew, but looked like a fashionable store mannequin. The children would never recognize their father, I felt, so I did not take them to the funeral. What I intended as an exercise in courage for the sake of my children was interpreted years later by my daughter as indifference. My mother never had the time to mourn my father's death. My husband had no pension. His $5,000 life insurance had to be used to pay his medical and funeral expenses. In the summer of 1942, I was invited by the Dean of Boston University to develop a course in medical secretarial procedures. At the small salary of $1,800 a year, it was providential.
I don't want you to worry about things, Mummy. I am learning a lot. Now that the hardest 20 years of your life are over, you deserve all the returns you can get. P.S. I will grow up in jerks, it seems. So don't feel my growing pain so vicariously, dear.
All the girls in Haven House were invited to Maureen Buckley's coming out party.
Dear mother, how can I ever tell you what a unique, dreamlike and astounding weekend I had? On Saturday afternoon at 2 p.m., about 15 girls from Smith started out for Sharon, Connecticut. Marcia and I drove a cream-colored convertible with 3 other girls and a Dartmouth boy. Picture me then in my navy blue bolero suit and versatile brown coat, snuggled in the back seat of an open car. Snuggled? Whizzing for 2 sun-colored hours through the hilly past.
The late afternoon sun then.
Were almost more than I could bear. At about 5 p.m. we rolled up the long drive to the Elms. God! Great lawns!
Huge trees on a hill.
With a view of the valley. Distant, green, cow pastures.
Orange and yellow leaves.
A caterer's truck was unloading champagne at the back.
Champagne?
We walked through the hall, greeted by 1,000 living rooms, period pieces, rare objects of art everywhere. Marcia and I and Joan Strong,
A lovely girl.
had the best deal. A big double bed and bath to ourselves. We lay down under a big quilt for an hour in the grey-purple twilight, conjecturing about the exciting
Unknown.
evening fast coming. June, Marcia and I were driven in a great
Black.
Cadillac to the Sharon Inn, where a lovely buffet supper was prepared.
After supper,
Another hour of lying down.
Scarlett O'Hara before the ball.
And then the dressing. Up the stone steps, under the white colonial columns of the Buckley home. Girls in beautiful gowns stood clustered by the stairs. Everywhere there were swishes of taffeta, satin, silk. I looked at Marcia, and we winked at each other. Walking out in the patio, 2 stories high, with the elm treetops barely visible through the glassed-in roof.
Remember Mrs. Jack's Bhatia?
The same! Vines trailing from a balcony.
Fountains playing.
Balloons, Japanese lanterns, tables covered with white linen. A band platform built up for dancing. I stood open-mouthed,
Giddy.
wanting so much to show you. If you had seen me, I looked.
Beautiful.
Even daughters of millionaires complimented my dress. At about 9:30, we were standing in fluttering feminine groups, waiting for the dancing to begin. I began to wish I had brought a date, wondering if I could compete with all those tall, lovely girls there. Let me tell you, by the end of the evening, I was glad I hadn't. First, a tall, lovely, hook-nosed freshman named Eric cut in. Turned out we both loved English. Next, I had a brief trot with the editor of Yale News. No possibilities there.
Now suddenly,
A lovely, grinning, dark-haired boy cut in. Name, I asked. Constantin. He was a wonderful dancer and twirled, so all I could see was a great cartwheel of colored lights. Turned out his father was a Russian general. Oh, I danced steps I'd never dreamed of, and my feet just flew. A tall boy who claimed his name was Plato did the sweetest thing. In the midst of dancing, he said, I have a picture I want to show you. So we
crossed.
through the cool, leaf-covered,
Patio.
the sound of the
Fountains.
dripping, and entered one of the many drawing rooms. Over the fireplace was a Botticelli.
Madonna.
You remind me of her, he said.
I was really touched.
Imagine meeting such fascinating, intelligent and versatile people and saving best to last my Constantin. He cut in and we danced.
And danced. Finally,
We were so hot
and breathless.
that we walked out on the lawn. The night was lovely.
Stars. Trees big and dark.
So guess what we did?
Strauss waltzes.
Oh, you should have seen us swooping and whirling
Over the grass.
with the music from inside.
Faint and distant. Imagine, on a night like that, to have a
Handsome.
perceptive,
May I kiss your hand?
tell you
How
beautiful you were. I asked him what
happened?
when a woman grew old and her physical beauty waned, and he said in his lovely
Liquid.
voice, why, she will always be beautiful to the man she married, we hope.
I asked if I could tell him my favorite poem. I did.
And he loved it, all
Oh, if you could have seen the wonderful way he talked.
About life and the world.
Imagine, I told him teasingly not to suffocate in my long hair. And he said,
What a divine way to die.
Probably all this sounds absurd and very silly, but I
Never.
expressed myself so clearly and lucidly. When someone kisses your shoulder and says, "You are charming, beautiful, and most important,
Intelligent.
It was striking 5 when I fell into bed beside Marcia.
I dream.
Exquisite dreams.
Back here.
I can't face the dead reality. I still live in the world
With Eric, Plato, and my wholly lovely.
Constantine.
Under Japanese lanterns.
100 moons twining in.
Dark leaves.
The music spilling out and echoing inside my head. To have had you there.
In spirit.
To have had you see me.
Another production, quite different from this as well. This, as you could see, was meeting of these two characters at all. But as we went into it and as we worked further and further, and as you saw as the sentences as they develop in the play, finally they're doing even individual words so that you build up a very different kind of a mood and a tempo in the entire play. So that's very much how Letters Home was staged, of course, with the rest of the set and things that also supported it a great deal. Maybe we can go straight into this. Up, Chanari, projector go. So the rehearsal process were entirely workshopping. The actor here on my right, with his Nara as the tail, you can make out with that Sheikh Khan. The other character is Tabaki, the jackal in the forest. So these are the two characters, the more villainous characters who come in very keen to eat this baby. And the mother then, in the subsequent scene, takes the child to the Council of the Free, which is the collection of wolves who have to decide whether or not she can keep the child. Now in doing this, what did we do? How did we develop that first sequence, even though we had a script? Let me just share some things from my own production cookbook, which I won't be able to read in this life. Kuch slide dena hoga iske liye, Tribhuvan. We just took two separate situations out of that and improvised it. So these are the images that came through in our improvisation. The mother lying down with the pups all feeding, the different personalities and temperaments of the other children, the favorite child, the outsider, the one who tries and experiments, the mother rules over them, the child ventures out, finds a rabbit, the joy of killing the rabbit for the first time, playing and fun with the dead animal, the mother returns, the children blaming each other, usne kiya, usne kiya. So the rules of the jungle, what are the rules? The mother's chastisement, the food is outside, their joy, and still the need for going back to the mother for milk and sleep. And finally the image of them all lying all over the mother asleep. So these were some of the images that we used in doing this scene. Then we wanted to break away just from the idea of wolves because it's very confining. So we did another very interesting improvisation. Two different nesting couples, sparrows. Sparrows living in a Delhi DDA house. Okay? So the pregnant wives and the husbands in search of accommodation. Okay? Should we build it in a flat? A big discussion between the couple. Should we go into a flat or not? But the mother insists it has to be a flat which has a TV because I'll be totally confined. I can't move around at all. These are sparrows. Our nest must be in a place where we can see the TV properly. Okay? So then two couples arrive at the same flat to build their nests. Two different couples. One builds and the other one goes on stealing the things from this nest and builds their own nest. Okay? So a lot of development of character over there. From these 2 or 3 different improvisations that we did with these characters, we created that sequence in the cave that we just saw. And much of the dialogue that we had improvised, which I was documenting as we went along, we wrote straight into the scene. So it's quite a departure from Kipling's original scene of the adoption of the child. The adoption is of course there, the interaction with Sher Khan and Tabaki is there, but a lot of the other dialogue is written by the actors in the process of the rehearsal. I felt the need for the entire cast, of whom some are ex-NSD people, many people are from Shriram, many people have no experience at all or have come from different parts of India to work with the TI company. to give us some kind of a common grounding. So we spent a lot of time. My approach with them was flooding. I flooded them with things. So we went to the Japanese costume exhibition that was on. We saw masks from all over the world to design the kind of headdresses we would use in the play, and the cast was all involved in that. We experimented working with different materials together, and we spent a lot of time seeing films on animal movement. We spent many hours seeing what is the arch of the back, how to use all the 4 feet, how is a panther different from a leopard, different from a tiger, different from a wolf, and tried to recreate a lot of that. People who've seen the production will just for these arms automatically to be around the neck of the mother. And here she is with all the different characters trying to argue out, the mother argues out her case. And here we use the levels, including a level very far back where you can see Bagheera right at the back over there. And you can see how they use their hands constantly as claws, and they constantly went from 2 legs to 4 legs using their hands and legs together. And we decided to do away with masks and only use headdresses. But you can see here in the foreground how the headdress was used, so that we use the expressions on the mask as well, or the headdress as well. Then Mowgli grows up. This entire sequence that follows came totally out of improvisation. In the open air theatre, we tied ropes up in these trees, made the entire cast climb up these ropes, very quickly went onto the top of the arches on one side of the theatre. So he adopted this as this space. This was his space. And next to him came Bhalu, climbed into the champa tree over there and decided to go to sleep in the champa tree and then get up, break a hive, eat honey out of it. And many things came out of those improvisations as well. So while we were doing these, the cast got very interested in animals of different shapes and sizes. This is Bagheera in the foreground and Bhalu. And then we worked on creating all these puppets. So here is the ladybird. We wanted to have the whole range of animals, from this tiny little ladybird hand puppet done in the Bunraku style of the actor being totally visible to the audience. And then Mowgli's reaction that builds into a song which we wrote. Then from South America we took this idea of puppets that just pop out of cones and made this jumping puppet beautifully manipulated by this particular actor, very lively, which he goes to catch and can never succeed in catching. And then we created these dragonflies, which are literally, we kept them the way they are. They are table tennis balls and bodies made by the people who are manipulating them, and a very delicate movement of these, an interaction between these 3 tiny little puppets on that large Meghdut open air stage. And to counterpoint this, we had the huge puppet, which was of course Kaa, 20 feet long, manipulated by 2 people, and this is the entire sequence that we used with Kaa. Which could jump 2 people at the same time. It was so long. The head was fiberglass, and even though it was fiberglass, extremely heavy for Kiran, who played Kaa along with the other actor. And a lot of their interactions came totally out of an improvisational process. As for this, we could really disappear into Kaa's mouth very easily in this play. She was right in, okay, and is rescued from there. And then, as you know, in the second half of the play, we developed these 2 characters, Sher Khan and Tabaki. And I must say, Sher Khan went through many avatars in the improvisational process. He started off as being the film actor Ajit, okay, with his Mona darling kind of dialogue. He played around with that. Then he became a very interesting character with a balaclava and a stick, somewhere like a chowkidar. That was the kind of image that was created by the actors. And finally we came to this very interesting relationship between Tabaki and him all through. And they wrote a song. This is another puppet in the play, that flying bird at the back. They wrote a song with them together where Tabaki makes fun of Sher Khan, and both the actors who played Tabaki in alternate shows almost did it like a mudra sequence. Now this only came from literally jamming and improvising together. So this is from that sequence of both of them. Then of course in the more climatic scenes, Bagheera tells Mowgli to go into the village and bring the red flower, which is the fire from there. You can see constantly in all these scenes we've used the tree as a character at the back. The tree is constantly lit and is very much a part of all the action. And finally they encounter Akela, pull him out, and then he attacks him, and this is the sequence with the red flower and Mowgli. In the last scene of the play, Mowgli returns after having that brief episode in the village, but of course he is grown too distant and far from the jungle, and they tell him that he must make his own way. A very moving sequence. The TIE debated a lot. Oh sir, आप बच्चों से कोरोना आ जाएगा शो के एंड में. बच्चों के प्ले हमेशा they should be very happy endings. I said no, there's no need. I don't think Mowgli is a very happy story in any case. And if we're calling it ये भी जंगल वो भी जंगल, it makes sense. So this is the very moving last sequence in the play where Mowgli says farewell to all the people there. Finally enters the auditorium and bows down to them. So he joins all of us out here and they bid adieu to him. I think that's it on this. Done in an approach in a totally different kind of a way. I just wanted to demonstrate all of these just to suggest to all of you how every play requires a very, very different kind of process. And since I believe very strongly that theatre is a group process, an artistic activity that arises out of the hard work and experience of a closely knit team, it becomes very important that the team is cohesive. Very typically my plays require over 100 or 150 hours of rehearsal. For me, as important as the actual reading and discussing the play threadbare are the numerous chats over numerous cups of tea, older members of the group sitting in, sharing feedback at a rehearsal, and a collective brainstorming all the time on what a play means and how we can best express it. Rehearsals are therefore very much a trying out of different ways a play can be expressed, not only for the memorization of lines or the fixing of moves. So a lot of what you see in a play has been distilled from an experience in which I can safely say that 70% you will never see. It's all happened in the rehearsal process. And we continue these discussions right into the shows and even after the shows. For me, I believe that the more we believe in what we are expressing, obviously the better it will be. And therefore most of our work expresses what we see around us in contemporary India rather than focuses on the sexual escapades of Tom, Dick or Sally in New York or London. The stresses and strains on today's marriage, the different needs and wants of generations, the changing roles of today's woman, dealing with loss and with adultery, the loneliness and aloneness of the individual, these are my themes and preoccupations. Mine is not a theatre of isms. I do not believe in one ideology or another. For me, men and women become the measure of all things. I do theatre, therefore, because it is a meaningful expression for me, because this is my way of looking at the world. At this point, I'd like to quote from Mahesh Kuntwal, who himself quotes from UNESCO, who says, "Any work of art which is ideological and nothing less would be pointless, tautological and inferior to the doctrine it claims to demonstrate." A writer, this is Mahesh, back to Mahesh, a writer worth his salt writes from a very private core of his being, which is beyond the control of intellect, and so the vaster part of his perception is often subjective. It is to this that the reader or viewer has to respond in the same spirit. And I continue quoting from Mahesh, "In my personal mundane life, I go on making choices that are political in the ultimate analysis. It is inevitable that every cell of our existence is attacked by politics. Whether by Benson and Hedges instead of Charminar is very much a political decision, and these decisions change as situations change. But when one writes or creates, one leaves all of this behind and tries to reach the unchanging fundamentals of human life. Ideologies are fine and they do bring a little bit of redress and change in societies from time to time. But there is no religion, no ideology, no political program that has ever brought total happiness to humanity or that has freed humanity from pain and suffering. It is the human condition that directs the social condition and not vice versa. Art can never forget this, nor should it. Art tries to express an intangible reality and cannot limit itself to concrete ideological thinking alone. At the core of all reality is the subjective man, and that is why an individual's private pain is as important as that of a mass of people and can be shared by all of us as a universal experience. Just the last section where I talk about my own themes and preoccupations. In my own development as a director, I can see a major shift of focus over the years. That is quite frankly only discernible in retrospect. The first 5 years in Ruchika were focused largely on the production of the well-made Indian play, and there are very few of these. Between Arun Kukreja and myself, we directed a lot of these. Ashar Ka Ek Din, Aadhe Adhure, Gidhare, Sunnu Janmajay, Jalus, Tughlaq, Sakaram Binder, along with several others. Along with these, I regularly directed an experimental evening of short plays entitled Triumph, in which many in this room will remember the absurd theatre pieces, Mrozek's Trilogy, Out at Sea, Charlie's Striptease, Tadeusz Raziewicz's He Left Home, and of course finally Ionesco's Rhinoceros. During the emergency, 3 of my productions spoke out loud and clear against the aggressive anti-people policies of Indira Gandhi. These were Striptease, which is a horrifying short allegory of man stripped of all his dignity and self-respect by a disembodied female hand that appears at regular intervals to give him instructions. The play was staged 3 days after the imposition of the emergency, and Indira Gandhi appropriated the hand symbol for the party soon after. My next anti-emergency piece was Ionesco's powerful allegory on her exterior, Rhinoceros, dark, brooding, powerful. A depiction of a world where everyone turns literally and of course metaphorically into a rhinoceros, a big blundering beast that can only charge in a single predetermined path, sweeping down everything in its way. The last of my anti-emergency pieces was Budra Rakshas's Marjiva, the frightening story of a fear of the violence outside that forces a man first to kill his wife and later immolate himself, only to find his death exploited by the powers that be. 2 days after a show at the IIC Theatre Club, the police arrived and informed Sonu Krishan, who was then in charge of the IIC Theatre Club, that no more shows could be staged. Along with these, I explored the classics of modern theatre: Ibsen's Doll's House, Ghosts, Turgenev's A Month in the Country, and A Provincial Lady, Chekhov's shorter pieces, The Proposal, The Bear, The Anniversary, Strindberg's The Father, Camus' The Just Assassins, Miller's All My Sons, The Crucible, The View from the Bridge, Pinter, Ionesco's Sam Shepard, and then a very major change occurred in my own work. Till that time, of course, all writings, with very few exceptions, had been entirely by men. And as many of us know, the feminist movement was well on its way by 1980 in our own country. Much of the thinking in this area of the arts was based on Kate Millett's seminal book, Sexual Politics, which many of you all are familiar with. And in this book, and here I quote from Susie Tharu's introductory essay in her book, Women Writing in India, attention was focused on the images of women in mainstream literature. Disturbed by the sudden realization that women had invariably been represented in stereotypical ways by a literary heritage that claimed universality, feminist critics turned to women authors for alternative images of women. Women reared on the idea that great literature embodied in some quasi-mystical transcendental sense a universally and perhaps eternally valid ethic, or understandably agitated by what they now experienced as the masculine bias of the classics. Some critics spoke in terms of correcting a deficiency in the record, enshrined in the canon of the culture's finest literary achievements. Others, especially those who wrote as teachers, were more concerned with the cumulative effects such literature would have on the reader-student's understanding and response to life, and emphasized the similarity between the images of women found in popular literature, advertisement, children's literature, and those in the texts. Literary texts commonly cast women in sexually defined roles. Women are mothers, good submissive wives, bad dominating ones, seductresses, betrayers, prim single women. All they serve as the inspiration for the male artist. These were all clearly regarded as false images of women. There was a belief that women's writing would reflect women's real worlds and their real experience, and much of the most persuasive feminist criticism of the 70s and 80s were from the same principle. So the search began for the woman playwright, and where she did not exist in India, the novels of mainstream women writers were adapted by us for the stage. Kamla Das's My Story, Mahashweta Devi's Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maa, Kusum Ansal's Rekha Kriti, Manu Bhandari's Mahabhoj, which was done by NSD, Bharti Mukherjee's short stories, which we did, all appeared on stage in the 80s. And where women writers were not available, male writers with a strong feminist perspective were adapted. For instance, another contemporary play, Orni, staged by us, was an adaptation of Vijay Dandeta's folktale, King Chili. I'll just briefly describe the images in that. Orni is a metaphor defining the limits of a woman's existence. A piece of cloth, really beautiful, soft, encompassing, comforting. But as it enshrouds the face of Lachi, the newly married Gujar woman in Orni, it blocks, curtails, limits all desires and aspirations. An unguarded moment of ease, a glance outwards, beyond the limits imposed, and the cloak is rudely pulled forward, blocking from you all that lies beyond this invisible boundary. Boundaries. Who decides them? What does it take to go beyond them, to subvert them? Such questions arise as one watches Urmi, and stretching the edges of these boundaries with her laughter, scorn and later anger is Lachi. In doing Kusum Ansal's Rekhakriti of the play, we saw a very interesting use of myth in a very different way. Here the archetypical image is that of Kunti of the Mahabharata, a woman who wants to experience life, to live it to the full, but one who is also the mother of an illegitimate child. Kusum Ansal splits this image of Kunti into 5 different women in the play, and in this way she is able to explore in depth the various dilemmas that Kunti faces. First of all, there is Malvika, the lead character, a gawky young girl, terrified of the intimacy and her own and the physicality of sex, who grows into womanhood and creates her own form of spiritual ashram by the end of the play. Then there is her mother, Vinny, the restless socialite, very much in touch with her own sexual needs and who marries her daughter's lover. There is the early maid servant in the home, who suffers an alcoholic husband and his bigamy, and finally has the courage to throw him out and bring up her child on her own. Then there is the dancer who has led a life full of sensual pleasure and now looks for something more. And above all, there is the ever-present, yet forever absent Zorabai, who is the grandfather's mistress, neither Hindu nor Muslim, yet with tremendous significance to all the characters in the play. As we see it, the woman of today has to increasingly deal with a range of different roles. Those of wife, mother, beloved, mistress, daughter, often rebelling against the role expectations that go with them. And to what extent does she not conform? Does she rebel? Does she begin to articulate her own dilemmas and to ask uncomfortable questions? Not all women in India are Nora Helm of Doll's House, who can walk out on a husband and child, at least not here, where tradition can enslave and trap a woman in subtle, unthought of ways. And where are the dramatic texts that can allow this questioning? Does one find and expand spaces in existing texts or create or adapt others? For example, the middle-aged Sujata Mahashweta Devi's Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maa questions her own role in family and society. In the original novel, after reaching this point in her life, Sujata suddenly dies of a burst appendix. When we mounted a production of this play in 1981 and again in 86, we chose not to kill Sujata at the end of the play, as we felt that she had only begun on the process of re-questioning many of her life decisions. Several of the people who saw the play were in agreement with this change ending. I'm glad to know that in Govind Nihalani's film of the same name, he also ensures that Sujata does not die at the end. So there are many different ways in which these questions have been raised in different plays. They may be very directly stated, as in the Dario Fo and Franca Rame monologues that we've done, or in Urni. They may be also articulated in an oblique fashion. For instance, in the marvelously original Tasveer, each actor or actress in the cast played 2 diametrically opposed parts. So that gave it a different dimension. Or when we did Passion Play, we had a woman splitting into 2 halves when she comes to know of her husband's infidelity. At the most obvious, these 2 halves were the inner and the outer self, the id and the ego. That is more complex and certainly more dramatically exciting was when the inner self begins questioning the outer self and starts playing scenes as the outer self themselves. So this in brief are the kind of themes that I've dealt with. I don't think I have the time to go into looking at my own children's theatre work. Of course, there was a lot of work also which I've done in the area of street theatre, but maybe that another time, another forum. Thank you.
Thank you, Nazar. You had a very interesting presentation of this.
Line, you recite an opening line itself. But how did it happen that you didn't get the script?
An interesting question, Sir Rose, because everybody was very surprised that I started rehearsals without knowing the denouement of the play.
Yes.
Basically, the script had been sent to me by Mrs. Dalvi after Jaiman died. Somebody probably had suggested, forgetting who it was, that maybe I should be the person to do it here. It stayed for many. Looking back at his own childhood, he suddenly started mentioning a name that does not appear in any of his works, that of his sister. And Ruskin has a sister. She is mentally challenged. And somebody as creative as him could just, in a way, in my own words, annihilate this character entirely from his life. He could write about his childhood in great depth with a tremendous amount of sensitivity and nuance and feeling and emotion, and just do away with somebody who was there all the time through his growing up years. So this idea stayed in my mind. Why does one do that? Why do people choose to keep the disabled away from a particular situation? Of course, I've done about 30 films in this area, so I'm quite conversant with this idea, and also my wife works in the area of disability. Then I said, let's have a look at this play. And we tried. I thought of people at NSD who didn't have the time to read it to me in Marathi. So I got Gauri, who's in my group, who can read Marathi, can't understand, I can understand. So we read through the first 2 scenes. And I said, fine, this is it, we can start the translation. So we thought, now who's going to translate the play? Because I rely very heavily on Arun Sehgal, as I relied very heavily on Jay and Kaushal earlier. So we found an NSD student. And it became a 3-way process. He would read the play line by line in Marathi, literally. Then haltingly he would translate it into Hindi. That got recorded. Those tapes went then to Arun Sehgal, who then started scripting the play. When we were 5 scenes into the play, and I was sitting with Arun and hearing what he'd done as the final translation, I said, okay, this is fine. It's very interesting. I'm okay with this. I know all of Jayavant's other writing. I know Chakra. I know the serial which is now on Hasrate, which is based on characters written by him. I know, of course, Barrister, the other play, and Sandhya Chaya. So I had the faith that Jayavant would have done justice to the theme. And I said, let's start rehearsals. And the cast said, my God, you've not read the whole play through, you're just very sure. I said, yes, I am feeling very sure in this case. Let's start on it. So we literally went, I was always 2 steps ahead of them. I knew what was in the next sequence, but they didn't know. And I felt that was important because we'd use this when we also did Orni. Orni, we started with the story, with Vijay Dandeta's story. Again, very difficult to catch hold of because it's out of print. So we located a copy from somebody. I read it through. I said, yes, this is it. They said, there's no script. I said, doesn't matter. Let's start. So the first day was me and Smita. Smita had read the story at home, came, and she shared what she thought of the story. I shared what I thought of the story. And every day we added on 1 more member of the cast who had read the story the previous day, came into the rehearsal and shared what they thought of the story with what the earlier people thought of it. So we just got talking, and the story became larger and larger and larger as we talked about it. The theme sort of just spread all over the place, other than the language, which is of course very beautiful in his writing. And then we started thinking, how would we do the play? There was no idea how we'd stage it. So we created 4 totally new characters who became the chorus in the play. And then we said, somehow there's a strong need for music in this play. And we said, not folk, because once you go folk, you're particularized in specific parts of India. So I said, let's look. The cast said, what do you mean, look? I said, yes, you look. And we will only go back to theatre music. So Sheila Bhatia's opera, from one of our operas, I think from Chan Badlanda, which Smita and Mona had both been in years ago as little girls. They came up with 1 song from there. We picked 1 song from Jasma Udan. Somebody else picked a Himachali song. And we created a lot of the music of that play. When people saw it, they didn't realize songs were in Gujarati, Rajasthani, Garhwali and Punjabi. You didn't realize that. And then as we introduced a totally new thing into the play, which is Tripurari Sharma's song, Teen Gas Ki Odni, which became the sort of lead motif of the play. So rehearsal after rehearsal, we just explored together as a team of people how we would bring that story to life. There was nothing fixed at all. It was very much just improvising together as a group that we brought it together. So then we said, no, there's a need for the character Bhoja, very central in the story, to narrate stories to the Thakurji. So we said, okay, let's look at Gujarati folk stories. So from Gujarati folk stories, we picked 2. And the actor said, no, this is it, not that other one, for whatever reason. And then he translated and brought that into the script. So the script just developed in that way. Of course, very much pulled together by me, but it was that process. So in Rishte Naate, I think I was willing to, I had the faith in Jayavant Dalvi. Certainly I had the faith in the actors to be able to do it.
President, thank you. I want to thank you for 2 things. Sorry, not Draupadi, Kunti, so beautifully. And second, I want to thank you for using the word mentally challenged. Very few people in this world would do it. I do it. I use the word ashapt when I translate for blind school children. Thank you so much for using this beautiful word. And the thing that I want to share with everyone is that in '96, when the second Japanese author won the Nobel Prize, Kensei Oe, that was the first time the world heard about him, and we discovered that he has a challenged child who's now the top classical musician in the world, particularly in Japan, very well known the world over. When the child was born, the doctor said, he is going to be a vegetable. I'm going to put him to sleep. The father did not agree. He said, no, I'll bring him up. And he brought him up, and today he's a well-known musician. I just wanted to share this with you. Very few people are sensitive to bringing up a challenged child.
पढ़ते हुए किया, मैं उस पर अपनी एक प्रतिक्रिया बताना चाहता हूं, लेकिन एक सवाल पहले ये कि आपने जितने भी दृश्य आज डेमोन्स्ट्रेशन के लिए चुने, वो बाप बेटे या पति पत्नी और बेटे और पिता के बीच वाले दृश्य हैं। लेकिन हो सकता है कि ये मेरी व्यक्तिगत प्रतिक्रिया हो, लेकिन नाटक देखने के बाद जो कुछ मुझे याद रहता है वो होता है बॉस और स्त्री के बीच का जो संबंध है। और चूंकि उसके बॉस का चरित्र और उसका परिवर्तन बहुत आकस्मिक और अविश्वसनीय लगा मुझे, इसलिए नाटक का जो समग्र प्रभाव है वो सारा का सारा असंतुलित हो जाता है, बिखर जाता है। जो नाटक बहुत आत्मीय और अंतरंग संबंधों में छोटे छोटे अंशों में बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण और अपना सा लगता है, वो इन दोनों की रिलेशनशिप के अविश्वसनीय होने के कारण सारे नाटक के प्रभाव को गड़बड़ा देता है। हो सकता है ये मेरी व्यक्तिगत प्रतिक्रिया हो, और मुझे आपका वक्तव्य सुनते हुए ऐसा लगा कि शायद ये पूरे नाटक को एक साथ न पढ़ने की वजह से ऐसा हुआ हो। क्या आप इस पर थोड़ा सा प्रकाश डालेंगे?
I don't think ये इस कारण हुआ, क्योंकि हम लोग समझा रहे थे कि डायरेक्टर की नजरिए से in as small excerpts as possible, क्योंकि ये भी एक कंस्ट्रेंट था, how can we express कि किस तरह के सवाल हम लोग रिहर्सल्स में एड्रेस करते हैं। ये नहीं था कि संक्षेप में हम दिखाना चाह रहे थे कि रिश्ते नाते में क्या होता है, लेकिन डायरेक्टर के तौर पर कौन सी समस्याएं थी जिनका सामना करना पड़ा और जिसके लिए हमें अलग अलग प्रकार के समाधान ढूंढने पड़े। That was the reason of just ये छोटे छोटे सीन्स।
और कहाँ से मिली है ये भी अपन जानते हैं, लेकिन कोई ये आपकी अपनी खसूसियत है। लेकिन जैसे मैंने कहा कि वो खालीपन जो रह जाता था और जिसका मैं कारण नहीं तलाश कर पाता था, आज आपके वक्तव्य, आपकी बातचीत और आपके जो दोनों प्रसंग सिल्विया प्लास वाले भी और रिश्ते नाते, इनको मैं पूरी प्रस्तुति की तरह से नहीं देखता जैसे कि आपने कहा। मैं मानता हूँ उदाहरण के रूप में अपन इन दोनों चीज़ों को विश्लेषित करें और आपके वक्तव्य की तरफ देखें तो कुछ अच्छे महत्वपूर्ण प्रश्न जो सिर्फ आपके रंगकर्म से संबंधित नहीं है, बृहत्तर परिवेश में हमें ले जाते हैं। मैं उनकी तरफ ध्यान आकर्षित करना चाहूँगा। और मैं, अगर आप ठीक समझें, ज़रूरी नहीं है कि आप मेरी बात का उत्तर दें, लेकिन अगर आप ठीक समझें तो अपना पक्ष रखें। जब आप कोई भी नाटक उठाते हैं तो उसके पीछे आपने जैसे इंटरप्रिटेशन वाली बात की, लगता है कि आपका मूल मंतव्य नाटक को व्याख्यायित करना इस तरह से कि वो जो उसका पाठ है वो दर्शकों तक पहुंचे। सृजनात्मकता जो है उसके बारे में आपने बहुत साफ तरीके से कहा, क्रिएटिविटी ऑफ द राइटर, और उसमें आप अपनी ओर से कुछ क्रिएटिव नहीं जोड़ना चाहते, आप इंटरप्रेट करते हैं उसको राइटर। ये जो इंटरप्रिटेशन की तकनीक है वो बहुत ही खूबसूरत। लेकिन इस इंटरप्रिटेशन में कुछ सीमाएं रह जाती। अपन उदाहरण दोनों चीज़ों की, रिश्ते नाते का भी और सिल्वर प्लास वाले भी। पहले सिल्वर प्लास, क्योंकि उसके बारे में बात नहीं हुई अभी, तो कह रहे थे स्क्रिप्टिंग इसकी बहुत खूबसूरत। आपने जिस तरह से सेंटेंसेस को तोड़ा है, अलग अलग शब्दों से कहलवाया है, तो बिल्कुल नया अर्थ ध्वनित करते हैं। आप अनायास उन साधारण से शब्दों में बहुत महत्वपूर्ण बात कह देते हैं।
जी, लेकिन सवाल करें डायरेक्ट तो उनसे बातचीत सुनेगा।
मैं सोचता था भूमिका बना दूं तो फिर शायद ये जवाब दें। अब ये नहीं, ये मैंने पहले निवेदन किया कि प्रश्न नहीं है, ये प्रतिक्रिया है, और अगर वो चाहें तो जवाब दें। मैंने बतलाया कि मुझे खालीपन नजर आता है, और इन दो उदाहरणों से वो बातें साफ हो गई हैं। वो खालीपन क्यों नजर आता है, वो क्या है, वो मैं बतलाना चाह रहा था। लेकिन अगर अपने पास समय का अभाव है तो जरूरी नहीं, वो उसको, हाँ, वो उसको अपन
अगर कुछ कहना चाहे, इस पर कमेंट करना चाहे।
पहले तो आपकी शब्दावली इतनी घनिष्ठ है,
इस पर दोनों की प्रतिक्रिया, ये कहना उसका अर्थ अलग है और उसकी प्रतिक्रिया, हंसने की प्रतिक्रिया का कारण अलग है। लेकिन वो जो, अगर हम ये चीज, ये स्क्रिप्ट मेरे सामने होती तो मैं इसको इंटरप्रेट करता अपने तरीके से, एंजॉय करता। लेकिन जब एक्टर्स के जरिए से आप कहलवा देते हैं तो सीमा में बांध देते हैं। मुझे वो जो संभावनाएं हैं स्क्रिप्ट की, वो सारी संभावनाएं उन संभावनाओं का क्षरण होता लगा, डाइल्यूट हो गई। मुझे लगा कि इस बात को कहने के लिए कुछ दूसरी युक्ति, प्रभावशाली युक्ति की जरूरत थी, जो शायद नहीं हुई। ये केवल इतना सही।
My simple question is, how do you perceive as a director your association with a writer, playwright? You are concerned with his script only, and after when you start production, he is out. He is absent from your whole venture.
No, I think I can talk a bit about this. In fact, these pages all went aage piche, they were right here with Lalita Palya's, Shimti Pali Baba, Nand Kishore Acharya's, Gulam Badshaw and Kusum Ansal's Rekha Kriti, all of which I did the first production. There was a very close interrelationship with the writer. Now, different writers approach it differently. When I did Mudra Rakshas's Majjiva, उन्होंने कहा कि जो आप करना चाहते हैं आप कर सकते हैं, you are full freedom. And we changed the play very radically in the rehearsal process, and finally said, give me the script, this is how I want to publish it, it works much better this way for an audience. With Kusum Ansal, it was a different thing. She came in to rehearsal, she sat, she talked. The stage adaptation was done by Arun Sehgal and myself, and wherever the characters or actors needed to talk with her, they called her in and said, we want to ask this particular thing, but she gave us the freedom. Nand Kishore Acharya, we had a different approach. He came to Delhi from Bikaner, and we had a reading of the play, and then the cast and myself gave him feedback. Then he came back for 3 days and he rewrote sections that we felt needed rewriting in the play. So with every writer, it's been a very different kind of a process. Many writers say, just take it the way it is. Manjula Padmanabham, when I did Lights Out, or Mahesh's play which I did, he said, you cannot alter anything, and I will not rewrite anything, and you just do it the way that you want.
Thank you very much.